It's 6:03. We'll get going. I really couldn't believe or could have predicted that in the 1 week since the last time we met, there would be so much, 2 weeks, excuse me, be so much news and so much has happened in 2 weeks. Almost everything has changed. Um, some things haven't, of course. And of course, the thing that hasn't changed is nothing has happened in terms of the hostages. And there's no sign that anything's going to happen relating to the hostages anytime soon, which of course is very depressing and got to be unbelievably hard on those families. As you all know, I walk through the hostage square almost every morning on my walk with my dog, and every morning it's one day further, one more sad day, and somehow people have normalized that in the country to some extent. And we've normalized the fact that we don't seem to be able to do anything in order to get them back. And meanwhile, we've been totally distracted by the events of the last 2 weeks. So let's look back at these 2 weeks a little bit and then see where we stand at the moment. Um, just to state, at the moment, this is a very strange place. It's a place of waiting. Tomorrow is the 1 year anniversary of the beginning of the war. There's no doubt there's going to be an Israeli attack anytime soon on Iran, whatever consequences. But let's look back a second, because last time I spoke, it was 2 weeks ago, and so much of what happened, hadn't happened yet. But we started, of course, with going back even a little further. We started with the beepers, and then beyond the beepers came, and this is, by the way, you should all read the article. I'll link it in tonight's update in the Washington Post today. It's a good article that sort of goes through as much as possible what's known about how Israel did it, and what the idea was to use it. In any case, the beepers immediately created a hole in the ability for Hezbollah to communicate. That hole was exploited by Israel quickly. And of course, that led to the assassination from the air of Nasrallah. Not only him, but his complete command. But even the day before they did that, the 2 days before, there were major attacks on the Hezbollah missile systems. And much to everybody's surprise, and no one, it's one of the big questions everyone keeps on asking here. How is it that we were so afraid for so long of what Hezbollah would do, including me? I said we should wait until we have lasers. But I don't think anyone expected that our attack on the missile systems, combined with destroying the communication systems, would put them in a position where they were not able to respond in any significant way. There has been altogether one rocket fired by Hezbollah central Israel through this whole thing. They've fired plenty of rockets up north. And the amazing thing, despite all the rockets being fired, not one person has been killed from rocket fire since the whole offensive began. Not one single soul has been lost, and only a few people have been wounded from the rocket fire from Lebanon. And this was something that we feared for 15 years. We were afraid to get involved in Lebanon. We were afraid to attack the Iranians, but we were afraid of attacking Lebanon because we were afraid what Hezbollah would do with their rockets. Now, in retrospect, after you read the Washington Post article, which basically says that thanks to the fact that Israel had placed devices and explosions in all the walkie-talkies being used by the Hezbollah people, we've been listening into every one of their conversations for 9 years. Look, their conversations and the locations of the conversations. And therefore, if you can imagine the job of whoever was creating a map of targets in Lebanon, they knew and they know where almost every single Hezbollah rocket is located, where every storage facility is located. Some are easier to get, some are harder to get, but in a coordinated effort, they've been getting them one after the other. They're continuing to do it. They've been attacking the Dahia, which is the southern suburb of Beirut that is no longer occupied. People all left the Dahia because of the attacks Israel has been making. But as a result, that is where Hezbollah has managed to hide some of its long-range weapons. And as we can see from the attacks in the last couple of days, the secondary explosions have been quite impressive, which means they've been hitting more and more munitions. And without the ability to communicate, without the ability to move the weapons from wherever they're in storage to whatever launchers they have left, they've been relegated to relatively small amounts of fire. I mean, it's hard to say small amounts when 800 rockets were fired over the last 4 days in northern Israel. But again, 800 rockets were fired. Almost all of them were either intercepted or fell in open fields. And compared to 2003, before we had Iron Dome, when dozens and dozens of people were killed by the rockets, this has been, I won't say miraculous, but miraculous in the sense that it's worked. So we got that far. We continued. We've seemed to have gotten also the person who was appointed to replace Nasrallah, and it's not confirmed, but it seems pretty high, that 90 and something percent that we killed him as well. No one seems to want the job right now as head of Hezbollah. It seems to be a rather short-term gig, which no one would want. And the fact that we seem to have whatever the intelligence we have is still right on, and we're able to find the next person who's been assigned the position, says a lot. Now, all of that led, of course, to the Iranian attack last week. It's interesting, that was last Tuesday evening. And of course, Tuesday evening was also the terror attack that took place in Tel Aviv, Jaffa. From the 200 rockets that were fired, there were no Israeli casualties. From two guys who were equipped with knives and stole a gun, they killed 8 people. So, seems to be the low tech and not the high tech. Let's put it that way. Some of their rockets did get through. As we've seen, people have been posting pictures and saying, "Oh, the defense doesn't work." They show an interceptor going up, and the rocket keep on coming. The people who post that do not understand anything. Somebody's not muted. Please mute yourself. But in any case, they're not understanding because what they see going up are the Iron Dome, which are the final defense systems against the ballistic missiles that weren't designed to do that, as opposed to the Arrow, which intercept high over the atmosphere, sometimes outside the atmosphere, and they would not see it going up from near the point of impact. But clearly, a few rockets have gotten through. I think, and again, don't have this from inside information, that the decision was made to let more rockets land in the Negev, theoretically at the Navatim Air Base, than to let them land in central Israel, where there could be more casualties. I would assume that all of the things that could be hurt in the airbase were either underground or flying and weren't sitting there waiting to be hurt. And whatever else could be hit was not going to be particularly problematic, and much less so than if it would have hit Tel Aviv. So I would assume there was a decision made to put more resources to intercepting rockets heading towards the center, but I don't know that. Just an assumption on my part. In any case, that has left Israel with the dilemma of how to respond. And clearly, it's not going to respond in the way it responded last time, which was minimally, which was the idea. The response last time was to take out an anti-aircraft system that was guarding one of the Iranian nuclear facilities, giving them the idea, look, we took that out, you weren't able to stop us, therefore, if we wanted to, we could have taken out your nuclear facilities. So that didn't work. They obviously didn't think that was strong enough. As I wrote last night, to be honest, the logic of what the Iranians did sort of escapes me, other than a fact of desperation. We have to show we have resolve, we can fight, etc., etc. From a realpolitik point of view, it made no sense to attack Israel at this point. and the assumption that Israel would not respond, that's ridiculous. The assumption that the United States will hold Israel back, well, maybe to some extent, but I'm not sure that the Iranians will be happy with the choices we make if we don't hit the two things that America wants us not to hit. There are four different types of targets in Iran. There's the oil, there's the nuclear facilities, there's government symbols of power, etc. And there is, of course, military bases. So the US doesn't want us to hit the oil, which is the easiest to hit, because that'll immediately push oil prices up on the world market. And it doesn't bring as much money to Iran as one would think. But the US certainly doesn't want us to do that. They are reluctant for us to hit the nuclear facilities. I think not so. I mean, yes, they're afraid of an all-out response, but I think also they are concerned that we won't fully succeed, and therefore we'll need their help. It's not at all clear at this point in the cycle of building a bomb whether it's possible to take it out anymore at this point, or if we have enough fissionable material. Do we know where the fissionable material is, etc.? I don't know. On the other hand, just the other source would be, for instance, I would think, without knowing anything in particular, that the head of their Secret Service headquarters, they wanted to take out our Mossad headquarters. Well, I think it would be pretty easy for us to take out the headquarters of their secret police and all those wonderful people. I don't think there'll be too many Iranians shedding tears if we eliminate the headquarters of the secret police and similar type institutions of this government. Look, the long-term key has to be to undermine the government. How you do that is a very tricky line to walk. But I hope we know how to do it. Let's put it that way. The United States, like I said, I think will support no 2 and 3. They sort of oppose 1 and 2. How strongly they oppose 1 and 2, I have no idea. Biden and Netanyahu have not spoken, from what I understand, as of earlier today. They're not best of friends, let's put it that way. So we'll see where that happened, how that happens. Good chance that the Israeli attack will take place tomorrow. After all, it's the anniversary of the attack on us. For political reasons, of change the discussion. So I would suspect, without knowing, that would there'd be a good chance it'll happen. But we'll have to see. We'll have to see what it'll do. The Iranians, of course, are threatening a strong response. What that means is unclear. How many more missiles they can take out, I don't know. One of the things I am hoping that we're going to take is their factories for building missiles and their factories for building drones. I'm sure the Ukrainians will be very happy if we do that. So we'll have to see. If those clearly should be number 1 and 2 targets of the Air Force if we go in there. Limit the amount of additional rockets that they can produce. So.
Can people mute? There's just all sorts of background going on. It's terrible.
Okay. So that's where we stand vis-a-vis Iran. It's a waiting game. I guess we'll find out, at the same time the Iranians will find out where we're going to attack. And as to what their response will be, don't know. Again, we have to assume that a couple of their rockets will get through. But Israelis have been really good at following directions. People all in their safe rooms or in their bomb shelters. No one takes this not seriously, let's put it that way. And also, thankfully, as opposed to people who live in the north who get 20 seconds or 30 seconds warning from an attack, we literally get many minutes of warning. And so the home command can basically tell us 10 minutes out, stay very close to your bomb shelters, and then 3 minutes out, tell us to go in, or 4 minutes out to go in. So that worked very well last time. But where it goes from here in terms of that, we'll have to see. Any given time, this could break out. The attack could happen at any given time. Lebanon. Let's go back there for a second. Beyond decapitating the leadership of Hezbollah, the ground forces have been moving in pretty far. They now have asked not only all the Lebanese villages up to the First River, but to go as far as the Alawi River, asking, which is further north, telling people to leave their villages in southern Lebanon and go north. Israel's going to have to figure out how far it wants to go. There's been some fights and there've been some resistance, but it's been relatively limited. And I think that more than anything else has allowed the Israeli troops to move forward on a pretty, constant basis at this point. So it's really a question of deciding how far they want to go. The real question is, what's the ultimate solution? And the ultimate solution has to come from the Lebanese ultimately. Because ultimately, what has to happen for us to leave Lebanon is for the UN resolution that called for disarming the militias to take place, and for the Lebanese government to be the only government, the only people who have arms in the country should be the Lebanese government and not any third parties. That's what the UN called for 20 years ago. And now it's the time to enforce that with Hezbollah being so weakened as it's been. Will there be leaders in Lebanon ready and willing to do that? I do not know. Lebanese people certainly are ready for that. Lebanese people have had, unrelated to us, have had some really, really difficult times over the last couple of years, primarily thanks to Hezbollah, but not only. And so one could hope that that the Lebanese people will get together at this point and the government will take action and make those changes. But there's no way of knowing that for sure, to say the least. In terms of Gaza, we went in today to Jabalia refugee camp in northern Gaza. This is our third visit to Jabalia. We went there because Hamas was reconstituting itself there. And that's really the problem that keeps on returning. The plan for the day after seems to be no plan. It seems to be let Hamas rule in any way it can until we come in and kill them again. And we can keep on doing this. Now, the original plan, the plan did call for going back time and time again. The question is whether that included this sort of periods where they're really reconstituting themselves and they're the civil authority. Because we've been letting them take the humanitarian aid, they have control over the humanitarian aid. They're making a lot of money off of the humanitarian aid. They're reselling it. It's their point of power. And so, it's not, it's allowing them to remain in power and even strengthen them to some extent. Because it's the only thing there is the humanitarian aid. So they're controlling it, and they're controlling the point of power. As you saw from the survey from last night, which I'm not sure I totally trust, but at least based on that survey, Hamas is not very popular in Gaza at this point. If the people were given an alternative, I think they would go for it. But again, will they go for it and risk the armed forces of Hamas? I don't know. And Israel, without a plan, can't really change the direction. Really, this goes all the way back. Where tomorrow's a year into the war, and to the best of my knowledge, there has not been a formal discussion of Gaza the day after by the Israeli government up to this point. I'm sure some people in some rooms have had discussions, but I don't think there's been any formal discussion whatsoever. And that's very problematic because without a plan, you can't institute anything. That's where we stand with that. We, of course, got the Houthis. We had another raid down with the Houthis last week. Once again, we pounded them much more than the United States and Great Britain has, although the US and Great Britain did have a significant raid on the Houthis on Thursday. That was after The Houthis tried to fire at U.S. warships crossing Bab el-Mand, which is the straits in the bottom of the Red Sea, and the United States responded with 22 attacks on Houthi sites inside of Yemen. It requires a much more sustained attack, and I fear troops on the ground, which of course America doesn't want to do, in order to stop the Houthis. So that's really where we stand in terms of the Houthis. In terms of everything else domestically, nothing's been solved. I mean, it's as I wrote, Gideon Sa'ar has joined the government. He makes all sorts of claims that, oh, I'm doing it because I'm doing it for the people, and you have to be part of this government because we're at war. What it really amounts to is he was afraid that he was behind on the in all the polls. Behind. He wasn't getting in the Knesset. He didn't exist in the Knesset vote. And this was his way of maintaining some sort of relevance. It's the problem of politicians. Politicians don't know how to leave politics. I mean, he's been a politician for, I don't know, 20 years. He's been a member of Likud. He never quite made it to the top. He was never all that popular. And this was his way of getting back into Likud. It's pretty despicable. And then again, politicians are politicians. And we have pretty despicable politicians. The last front I should not forget about, of course, is the West Bank. There have been various attempts at creating violence from the West Bank. It seems the Iranians have been spending money, paying money to operators and trying to smuggle in arms. We have an open border with Jordan, more or less. It's easy to smuggle. We're now talking about building a fence along that border. I mean, think about that. Now we're thinking about it. But we have an open border, and arms are being smuggled from Iran or wherever else across the border into Israel. So we'll have to see. We discussed earlier the Jaffa terror attack. We had a terror attack today in Beersheba, which I didn't mention yet, and that, of course, another cloud the day before the anniversary. Once again, terror to the Negev. One woman, a soldier, was killed. 7 or 8 other people were wounded. The terrorists was from the Bedouin and the Bedouin tribe, and his brother 9 years ago created another terror attack. Okay. So that's where we stand now. Just now, that's why I'm looking down at my watch for a second. The Army spokesman unfortunately said that for the last few hours there have been rumors of saving some hostages in Gaza. Those rumors, unfortunately, are false. So that's too bad. We seem to be acting in areas of Gaza we didn't act before in the central camps. We've told the residents to move south. We've increased the size of the humanitarian zone and trying to push as many people as possible in south to clear the north up. Is it part of the famous general's plan? I don't know. The Army claims it's not. But on the other hand, look, something has to be done. We can't keep on playing the same game and not making any progress at all, either in terms of the hostages. We need to find some way of putting pressure on Sinwar to make a deal. For as much as I disliked Netanyahu's actions over the hostages over a period of time, and no doubt there's some part that he's responsible for the fact that some of them are old and not back. The fact is that at the moment, Sinwar seems to be the one who does not want a deal. He has no real reason to have a deal. He's hoping something will go wrong with our war with Iran. So far, he has to be disappointed in the way things are going with Hezbollah. There needs to find ways of putting pressure on Sinwar at this point. Maybe putting ourselves in charge of some of the humanitarian aid would be one of the ways. the problem is it's a slippery slope to doing that and directly occupying Gaza. Is that what we want to do? We probably don't want to do, but we may have no choice at this point because we didn't come up with a plan. And then maybe that was the plan all along, not to come up with a plan, so we'd end up occupying it. I don't know. But nothing has been discussed. Again, Netanyahu is dependent on Ben Gvir and Smotrich. I should note that the interesting thing happened. Interesting is almost, I don't know if you call it interesting, but Ben Gvir shows up at every terror attack to show that he's there. This time he was largely booed by the crowd around, yelling at him that he's failed. But of course, he promised security, and of course, while it's not 100% his fault, he's done little. But he then started screaming, literally screaming as if he was an opposition person. The government has to pass my law to remove the families of terrorists, including Israeli citizens, terrorists, from the country if a member of the family engages in terrorism. That I would think would not stand the Supreme Court. Of course, that's why they wanted to overturn the Supreme Court, but you can't eject to exile an Israeli citizen because one of his family members did something. Just doesn't work that way in terms of Israeli law or any normal law. We do things a little bit more freely in the West Bank because they're not citizens, and that's a whole other story and for a discussion sometime after the war. Okay, we're at a half an hour point. At this point, I'll open up for questions. I hope people have questions. Please just raise your hands as you can in the system, and hopefully I'll see you, or else my wife will and tell me that I'm missing you. Paul.
Yeah, thank you, Mark. So, from where I'm standing, admittedly in New York, it seems like Israel has done an amazing favor for the United States, in particular, in the West in general, by taking out a lot of Hezbollah, showing Iran's weakness. Yet, it seems like the Biden administration is just, I would say, pathetic in its willingness to do anything. I mean, you've talked, and I read your a blog every night, and you talk about the need for regime change, and I think that's the only long-term solution. Yet, as far as anything I've read in your stuff and the major media, the U.S. is doing absolutely nothing to help. So, I mean, what's it going to take?
Okay, there's two parts to that. One part is, of course, more sanctions will help undermine the regime economically. As we know, sanctions have mixed results, but they do have some effect, and they do hurt the economy. The G7, Biden got the G7 to institute additional round of sanctions on Iran after the missile attack. So again, anything the United States does unilaterally is problematic. Anything the G7 as a group does is much more successful and can have much greater impact. And he did do that. The question is, what does that mean? Regime change is a long-term project. It's not a short-term project. It's not something you can do from today. The way you do immediate regime change is you send in 1 million troops and you take over the country and you get regime change. But without that 1 million troops or whatever number is required, you might take 1 million troops in Iran, I don't know. Then regime change is something you have to do slowly. I don't know that Israel's been doing enough towards it. I don't know the United States is doing enough towards it. I know the United States would favor it. But again, it's a long-term strategy more than a short-term strategy. Yes, the opportunities exist much more right now. What Israel has done in Lebanon and what Israel has done to Hezbollah is mind-boggling in a sense. I mean, in terms of an intelligence operation combined with an Air Force operation, and together with the intelligence, in other words, the initial intelligence being the Mossad, supposedly, and the secondary intelligence being military intelligence that has given a target list that has been unbelievable, and the Air Force hitting it all. There hasn't been a campaign like that, I think, in modern military warfare. I mean, you can compare these days in Lebanon in many ways to the beginning of the Six-Day War. But what that means going forward, I don't know in terms of Iran. What the United States would like to do, of course, the United States. Look, the United States is a long-term considers the Iranian regime an enemy more than anything else over a long period of time. So what we can do at this point, what Israel can do, Israel is going to do whatever it can to undermine the regime by hitting targets that will undermine the regime. The very fact that Israel will probably be able to do it will be a fact without too much opposition, will in itself undermine all the claims of the regime. And if it can blow up some really high value, high visibility targets, that will also affect it. Again, I think we have to, I'm not sure what expectations we can have so far. Look, the United States has sent more military aid to Israel than any time in its history, and more time than anyone is, would have thought. If someone would have told me that the United States is sending 2 aircraft carriers and I have no idea how many planes, but a huge number of planes to help defend Israel, that's very, very, very unusual to say the least. Will the United States participate in the attack? Initially, it said it would, sort of. The United States probably doesn't want to participate directly in the attack, but maybe its tankers will help refuel Israeli planes because Israel has a more limited tanker capability. Israel ordered new tankers from the United States a year and a half ago, but because of Boeing's problems, it's backed up in the Boeing production line, and it probably won't see it for another year or two. So I don't know what else I can say at this point. Ian Joseph.
Yeah, Mark, just a quick comment on regime change before I ask my question. Given America's recent history of attempted regime change in Iraq and Afghanistan, and even going back further to Vietnam, I don't think there'd be any broad popular support or even political support for attempted invasion and forced regime change in Iran unless America was directly attacked. That would change the equation. But I don't see any possibility for forced regime change in Iran. Unfortunately, we would like it to be different. I just don't see that. But that's just a quick comment.
I was to add to answer that. Forced no, encouraged yes. In other words, if we could encourage the Iranian people, they came close a couple of times. They just didn't have. They just failed to make it across the finish line. So, anyway, go ahead. Your question.
So the question is one of tactics versus strategy. And I presume that's why your background has changed to a sunny Tel Aviv. You're feeling more optimistic. But the question really is one of Israel has displayed incredible tactical and operational successes over the last few weeks. Intelligence driven, the Air Force has performed impeccably, but at the same time we see a lack of any strategy in every theater. When it comes to Gaza, no long-term strategy. When it comes to Lebanon, no long-term strategy, simply a tactic of driving Hezbollah back. When it comes to Iran, managing Iran, no long-term strategy. When it comes to the West Bank, no long-term strategy. And it all seems to be an ongoing game of just whack-a-mole. Terrorists strike, they rear their heads, they smuggle arms, strike them down, stop the arms smuggling, and it just goes on and on and on.
Okay, you're absolutely right about a lack of strategy. We don't have any strategic thinkers in this government, to be quite honest with you. We have no one with experience. Netanyahu has the most, and the only person in the government with really any deep strategic experience. Whether you like him or hate him, he has experience. The rest of the government is made up of people who have no real strategic experience, no geopolitical understanding or anything else like that. Literally, there's never been a government with so many people who have so little knowledge of geopolitics, experience in the international arena, foreign ministers who don't speak English or French for that matter. So it's that all those things are missing. Now, the question is, what is Netanyahu thinking, right? He's our strategy, whatever, for better or for worse, whatever he's thinking is the strategy at this point. He's trying to stay in office. We know that that's strategy number one for him. His most important thing is to stay in office. Now, to stay in office, he has two problems he has to work at the same time. One is he can't lose the support of his two far-right ministers, because the two right prime ministers, if they leave, bring down his government. Even with Gideon Sa'ar in, he can afford to lose Ben Gvir. He can't afford to lose Ben Gvir and Smotrich together. So he has to figure out how to keep them happy on one hand. On the other hand, Israel can't lose. If Israel loses, that's that's obviously a disaster for a strategy. That doesn't even work for him. So the problem is this. West Bank, there has been no strategy because Israel has been divided over the West Bank. Netanyahu talks about a two-state solution, but no one in Israel right now believes in a two-state solution, including the left. At least there's no immediate hope for a two-state solution amongst almost anybody in Israel. There's hope amongst the left that someday there'll be a two-state solution. Amongst the right, they just want to settle every part of the land of the religious right, I should say, land of Israel. Lebanon, I think there is a strategy here, which says, without stating it, and with hopefully the Americans are stating it, that the time has come for regime change in Lebanon, which means weaken Hezbollah to the extent where the Lebanese government can reform itself. It can elect a president finally, which it hasn't done for 2 years because Hezbollah has broken it, has blocked it. Weaken Hezbollah enough that the Lebanese army can actually overcome it and take control over areas and disarm Hezbollah, as long as they get the mandate from the people to do so. That would be a solution. That would be a strategy. That would be a strategy that would be welcomed in the whole Arab world. Return Lebanon to some normality. That's what most of all the people who used to go vacation in Beirut, because it was the vacation point for everybody, would love for that to come back. So that's the hope. Is it a strategy that can work? It's the only strategy that's really out there. It's the only outcome I could see that could end this there. In terms of Gaza, I guess the hope is at this point is the reverse. If at one point we thought by solving Gaza we could solve Lebanon, now the view is if we destroy Hezbollah completely, that Sinwar will decide his dream of the ring of fire coming down upon all of us is no longer, and he may decide to save his skin and make a deal. Will he? Will he instead decide to kill all the hostages? That's also possible. We really don't know. So that's as best as I can do. Rob.
Mark, I should have amplified that the lack of strategy seems to go beyond just the present government, but even to the general leadership that you see in Israel, or maybe I'm misreading it.
Look, someone said that the only strategy Israel's had for the last 20 years is figuring out how to hold on to the West Bank. That has been the strategy of the right governments that have been in control most of the time over the last 30 years, give or take. That is a strategy. The strategy being we will get stronger and stronger. We will economically outpace everybody, and we won't be threatened by anybody because we're going to be so strong economically. That strategy failed, obviously, on October 8th, October 7th, excuse me. So, yes, we've had a bad strategy or no strategy at all for the last 20 years. But on the other hand, we attempted strategies. I go back to the fact that there was a strategy. It was Oslo, it was Camp David, it was an attempt by Barak to create the Palestinian state. Palestinians said no to the best plans that were given. So now what's the strategy after they said no to it? It was Sharon's plan, which was unilateral withdrawal from Gaza, separation. And that was a strategy as much as could be. And he hoped that with separation, we could create the possibility of peace. That failed also because they were not interested in creating any sort of peaceful environment. So, it's really easy to criticize the Israeli government for lack of strategy. I certainly am no fan of this government, to say the least, but I'm not sure what my long-term strategy would be right now if I was the person in charge. Rob's iPhone, whoever that is.
Actions that are going on everywhere. it's just staggering. How can Israel keep this up on so many fronts and keep the military and keep it just seems like it's an impossible task to keep up on so many fronts.
It's not easy. It's particularly on those reservists who are spending an incredible amount of time in the army at this point. It's pushing their personal resources. The people who are busiest on all fronts is the Air Force. And they're quite capable. The one thing of this army always was and always will be, hopefully, is the Air Force is the most capable part of the armed forces. It attracts the best people, and attracts them. When I say attracts them, it gets them to stay in the army, in the Air Force longer than anyone else, because the people who in the Air Force love to fly, and there's no other place you can fly as much as you can if you stay in the Air Force. So the Air Force has the best people it could, and I think they're keeping it up. I don't know how long, but for the moment they're able to do it. I don't have an answer economically. It's going to be a problem, to say the least. Abigail. No, I guess not. Okay.
Hi, I'm here.
Yeah, okay, go ahead.
I'm here. So tomorrow is October 7th there, right?
Correct.
Yeah. So is there any talk or fear of there being attacks tomorrow that you're hearing about?
Yeah, very much so. There's in terms of terror attacks, there's a call for lots and lots of terror attacks. And so we don't know how many there'll be or what there'll be. Today's was considered sort of part of that. They've called for a day of terror. It seems that's being called for on the campuses of America as well. So, yeah, and the FBI has warned in the United States of terror attacks tomorrow also. So yes, there's a great deal of concern about that. They're doing whatever they can. Obviously, you can't stop everything. They're doing whatever they can. Marcy or Michael?
My picture moved around. I couldn't find the place to unmute. I would see if you'd agree, but there is a glimmer of hope for what you said about Lebanon, because there is a precedent of about 25 years ago when the country rose up against the puppet government of Bashar al-Assad and pushed that person out. And as a sidebar, to the best of my knowledge, every time the United States has tried regime change, whether it was Bay of Pigs, which almost brought the world to nuclear war, multiple attempts in South America for the sole purpose of protecting United Fruit Company. The current regime in Iran owes a lot of thanks to America, because we took out a democratically elected government and put in the Shah of Iran by force, primarily to protect British petroleum, and this is what it has wrought.
Well, don't forget the Shah though was in power for 20 some odd years. Also, there are a lot of cases in South America where U.S. regime change actually worked. A lot of places it didn't work. The best cases are the ones we probably never heard of. So I'm sure there are places the U.S. has influenced elections or other things to bring about regime change, and because we haven't heard about it, it worked out okay. But we'll have to see. I mean, look, the government is very unpopular in Iran. If there was a free election, they would be voted out tomorrow morning. Of course, there hasn't been a free election, but I don't know if we hurt enough of the symbols of the state, maybe it'll encourage people. But it's the only solution, because I don't think we can get rid of the nuclear program. We just need a different government there. Margot.
Can you please tell me who would be the better candidate in our election to support Israel? I know Trump is a wild card and you can't really predict anything he would do, but do you have a sense of it? Maybe it's better than my own.
Okay, I hate to wade into that minefield. I will say, okay, I guess I'm going to write an article before the election. I think I'll leave aside all the domestic things. Leave aside all the domestic issues, because domestic issues, America wants to elect someone for domestic issues whatever. I don't want to get involved in that, although I care deeply about American history and all of those things. I think the problem with Trump is the inherent isolationism that he and J.D. Vance bring. J.D. Vance is an absolute isolationist, America firstist. I think Trump has a true, if he loves anything, which I don't know if he can love anything but himself, but I think he has a positive feeling towards Israel. However, how that works in terms of American isolationism, pulling back from the world and everything else is problematic. And of course, the other part of that is what you said, the fact that we don't know from today until tomorrow what Trump may or may not do. I mean, frankly, it looks to me like he is getting deep into the area that the reason that Biden resigned. If you listen to any of his speeches in the last week or two, it makes Biden seem like a young man, but that's a different story altogether. So the concern, Israelis overwhelmingly want Trump. They like strong, and they also buy into the fact that Kamala Harris, in some ways or another, is a leftist, and therefore she's, anti-Israel, etc., which there's been no proof of that. But I don't want to go into that. I don't want to try to prove a negative. The only thing I can say is my concern vis-a-vis Trump is the fact that without a thought-out foreign policy, without a worldview that's conducive to Western alliance, I mean, you have to ask yourself a question now, right? Israel always was concerned that in only a short period of time to fight a war until the world would stop it. But somehow the world hasn't stopped us in any which way. There's been pressure about humanitarian aid, there've been various things, but there's been no great pressure on Israel to stop this war. You have to ask yourself why, besides the fact that Biden has a unique relationship with Israel, and there's no question about that. He's been the most pro-Israel president in American history, without a doubt. But the other question is, because the Western alliances actually think Israel's important and is part of that part of the West, and therefore, despite the poo-pooing and the condemning Israel for humanitarian and all the things that they do all the time, when push comes to shove, they basically let Israel continue this war. And part of that is the relationship that Biden has with the Europeans and the fact that it's an alliance and everyone's on the same side with that. So that would be my fear, and that's why I think whatever fears people might have about Harris and Israel, I think they're probably unfounded. There's an interesting article in today's Times of Israel by someone who's known her for a long time and traveled with her to Israel. But again, I think the issue is everyone's going to have to decide themselves. I'm not going to tell you how to vote at this point. I'll write some sort of article right before the elections, but I don't want to anger any of my readers, so especially the paid ones. Okay, Paul.
Yeah, so getting back to Lebanon, I think the last 2 weeks have exposed that Iran is very happy to let the last Hezbollah guy die, and while Iran holds his coat. Has this had any effect that you can see about making Hezbollah, consider like, why the heck are we dying for these guys who have shown no inclination to help us?
Okay, so before we say Hezbollah, we don't know who that is at this point. Let's start with the fact there is no leadership for Hezbollah anymore. We killed practically all of it. So one of my questions when I talk to people is, well, one of the reasons we may not be seeing so many rockets being fired is that the Hezbollah fighter out there in the field says to himself, do I want to risk my life firing this rocket at Israel? Why do I want to do this at this point? No one cares. I'm going to just be killed. One has to assume at this point that the morale of the average Hezbollah fighter, wherever he or she may be, it's almost all he's, must be pretty low. And so the answer is, I'm sure people are asking them that question. The question becomes now is, with Hezbollah decimated, unable to communicate amongst themselves, how do you get them to surrender? I don't know. We're going to be in that situation with, remember the famous stories of the Japanese on the islands, guys who were found 40 years later still fighting the Americans because they hadn't heard that the emperor had surrendered. I mean, obviously it's not going to be that period of time. but I could see over a short period of time that could be a problem. I don't know. We'll have to see. In the chat, Lisa asked whether anything has changed vis-a-vis the Haredim. The answer is no. The government is going to try to pass some sort of bill that'll get them out of serving. Won't be very popular, it'll be very unpopular, to say the least. But it'll keep the government in power, and that's all that really matters to this government, is to stay in power and not to deal with what needs to be done. That problem has to be solved. It has to be solved sooner rather than later. We just don't have enough troops well, at the moment we don't have enough troops. We'd have to, one of the things that hasn't been done yet, and this is a real big problem as far as I'm concerned, is we have not done the investigation that's been required to look at what happened a year ago. Has not begun because Netanyahu has blocked it from the beginning. And once it begins, it takes time. He keeps on saying we have to wait till the end of the war to begin it. Well, it's a problem because in order to plan the future of the army, we need to, first of all, understand what happened, why it happened, and then we need to say, okay, this happened, this is why it happened, this is what we could do in the future, this is the sort of army we need in order to make sure it doesn't happen again. Now, obviously, it means we can never leave 200 troops on the Gaza border or any other border, but it doesn't mean we need to have 25,000 troops on the border or any border. I mean, those are things that have to be discussed, have to be looked at. What are the uses of robots instead of troops? So all these sort of things need to be looked at from a very basic way, and only then can we determine our force structure and how many people we need. And I fear that we're not doing, by not starting the investigation, we're going to be years behind in coming to the conclusions we need and building the force structure we need to address the problems of the future. But first we have to get through the present, and the present could still be pretty dangerous in the next coming weeks. Okay, I want to thank you all. Okay, someone asked about transport. Okay, there's a chat here that I have not been following. Nancy. Okay, so the whole transport issue, the fact of the matter is that, as you all know, public transport doesn't work on Shabbat or the Chagim. We called up a few thousand additional soldiers over right after Rosh Hashanah. No public transportation means they had to get to places. Look, this government, the same point of view that all of these, the tens of thousands of Israelis who are stranded in Europe, they'll eventually make it back. The government could find solutions, but the government is really not capable of doing so many different areas. It comes down to, a very, very incompetent government with a reasonably competent military, but the government just doesn't do what it needs to do in so many different areas, and this is just one of the many areas. So, but most of the problems are a little bit overstated in terms of getting to everyone got there. Let's put it that way. They may have spent some money. They may have to take taxis. Friends drove them. All sorts of things, but of all of our problems, it's just one of the many, and it was dealt, it was okay in the end, and I think more than anything else. Okay, well, hopefully, we'll see you all in 2 weeks. Tomorrow's be an interesting day here, to say the least.